is in continuation with the earlier part. Here we are going to discuss the motivational aspects and approaches which are a part of the individual system, that is IAS, and this is very much required by the organization for its effectiveness, efficiency and continuation. So, the most important drive is motivation. If you are not motivated, then you don't work. Motivation is required at every sphere of life, whether it is work, learning certain things or doing some activities. Everywhere the most important thing is that the person must be motivated, and in organizational context it becomes more and more important because this is required for one's satisfaction of the needs and the goal attainment. The why of human behavior is a must for any organizational member to understand one's own behavior as well as the others' behavior. The whole notion of leadership depends on how the person, the leader, is able to motivate the followers for doing the things that are required to be done. Now here the arousal and dovetailing means attaching of the motivation towards work performance and achievement of organizational goals that become the how of managing behavior, how the behavior is to be managed, and this is, if you follow Herzberg, this is known as the extrinsic motivation, money, facilities, all the working hours. Now, here the formal organizational system has this responsibility to motivate the individuals as well as the groups towards organizational performance, and we have lots of theories like of Maslow, Herzberg, which focus on the content of motivation, which push the individual towards doing something, and that something is, whether it is a hobby or a job requirement, that is to be determined by the content of the individual's own understanding and the content of the job that he or she is required to do. The process theories are of Vroom, Porter-Lawler, Adams equity theory. Then we have the Festinger and Levin, who talk about the attribution theory. All these are theoretical perspectives, but these help the managers to devise methods by which the worker can be motivated. Now, why we are talking about this? This we must now learn. The formal organizational system, in order to coordinate with the individual system, has to follow certain guidelines and create the commitment of the individual towards the work. Here one needs to understand certain things, and this has been proposed by the socio-technical school. The work has to be continuous and reasonable, and this continuity and reasonable factor is demanding in its nature, but it should not be pushing the individual towards the back, the sheer endurance, and along with that a minimum variety, not necessarily novelty, is to be provided by the organization, because if one keeps on doing the same thing over and over again, there are evidences which point that this may lead to distress, accidents and so many negative aspects. So this is adding spice of life for the worker in the work life. And the other thing, that very important thing, is the need to be able to learn. One keeps on learning, and this is on a continuous basis. Here we attach the learning to personal growth, and personal growth is human right. Everybody needs to grow. Then we have the need in decision making, participation in decision making. This is not only important as a motivational aspect, but this gives a chance, an opportunity to the individual to extend his or her judgment, and this is also a human right. You should be able to judge where you are, what you are doing, what is needed to be done. Then for the organization, some degree of social support and recognition must be provided to the worker. This creates a need for belongingness, and this is also a human right. Wherever you stay for 8 hours or 9 hours a day, you must have that sense of belongingness to that place, and this is a human right. And the other need, very important I feel, is to be able to relate to what one does, not a mechanical perspective. A meaningful occupational identity is created, which gives human dignity to the person and also recognizes the person's opportunity to contribute to society, and this is also a human right. Everybody must be happy to learn that he or she is contributing towards a social cause by working. And there is a very important need that one has a desirable future through work, and it is not necessarily promotion. It involves training, redeployment, a career oriented approach, and development of greater skill, that is choosing the future by enabling oneself, and this is the duty of every organization to extend to the human being. This tendency to behave is the output of the individual system, and there is a need for an interface between the individual system and the formal organizational system. How that happens? We had already discussed it earlier, that this interface is with the help of communication, modifying, developing perception, developing personality, motivating the individual, and certain behaviors that may or may not be contributing to the organizational goals. Say there was a time when the people were in the organization were forced to go on paid holidays. Now this paid holiday may not be directly contributing towards the organization, but it is contributing to the individual system, and it is coming from the formal organizational system. This is how the interface is created. Further, to reduce the possibility of conflict, I had already said that the organization may deploy counseling, mentoring, and other kinds of human resource development. Basically, I am repeating myself, this is the HRD methods, training, performance management systems, career planning, etc. are part of the HRD, and the individual, the most important fact is that the individual in this context can be both organization, because he or she assimilates the total perspective of the organization and also as an employee. The individual is very important for understanding organizational behavior. We had already discussed it earlier, because this is going to cultivate mutuality, trust, integration, and the result will be there will be a positive interrelationship between the organization and its members. The interpersonal relations actually begin with the role relationship, and this is defined by the formal work groups, which is a part of the formal organizational system. So, the job is related, no doubt, with the individual, but is also identified with plurality. The individual just doesn't do the job as his work, but he relates to the total organization, to the formal structure, and all the work relations, which are all pluralistic. Say for example, the job of a guard. The guard is just not guarding the gates, he is guarding the entire organization, extending it to human welfare, social welfare, organizational welfare, and so on. And so many examples can be put here, but what I am trying to focus is that the individual is just not a worker or a manager. The person is integrated into the organizational sphere and also is happy about it. So, the interpersonal relationship we have to understand from various perspectives. One is the tendency to form informal groups. One just doesn't remain restricted by the job roles. So, one tries to extend his or her relationship to satisfy the social needs. These informal groups help in doing that. Earlier it was known as social loafing, where the need was that people become guards so that time is not wasted. But the human relations approach propounded by Mayo, Tavistock Group, Levin, all they tell us that the informal groups are important aspects of organizational entity. Social cliques are just not formed for negative purposes, they also are the basis on which the individual expresses his needs and understands others' needs. So, informal groups are just not to be neglected. The formal and groups and informal groups both are very important entities. Briefly, if you look at the components of individual system, we have certain aspects which are explained everywhere. First one we have talked about is the motivation, personality, the structure of the individual as well as the organization, the individual needs and expectations, perception of the individual and the perception of the organization, the tendency to behave in a particular way, the tendency also to regulate that behavior, and we have the internal as well as the external stimulus and communication. All these are interrelated, and you will find that this interrelationship is continuous in its process, in its shape and size, and there is nothing fixed that the person is to be having this much of motivation, this much of personality, not like that. It keeps on changing. That is why organizations need to be understood as dynamic entities which include the social dynamics as well as the individual dynamics. The FOS basically is the work related activities, rules and procedures, and creating compulsive contacts. But if these compulsions become threatening, pressurizing, they may lead to conflict, and again the organization has to resort to cooperation, adjustment and accommodation, and not the power techniques that were used earlier. The indirect source of the larger society is also made a part of the organizational setup, because in organization also one becomes a part of the social processes where we have assimilation, acculturation, socialization, which create values, attitudes and dispositions. Now, I had already said that the individual is shaped by the social processes, and these create the traits which are very typical to the individual, but these are also carried. One does not keep a bag of his special traits at the door, one carries it inside the organization. So, these must be taken care of and assimilated in the organizational process. Social cliques we have already talked about, which create that social conformity, affirmation of one's existence, and relate to basically while in the organization to the formal groups, and these formal groups, when they become a part of the organization, should not be too rigid. They must create that space for the individual and the group to have certain special characteristics which may or may not be part of the organizational requirements. Now, the informal groups are basically formed to satisfy those needs which are not satisfied by the organization and ultimately lead to certain cliques. Now, all the cliques are not harmful. There are sometimes when certain latent conflict happen and they develop into something negative. These cliques resist change. You hear about the strike, they stall the development, they create conflict, and these can be harmful to the organization. Now, here what the organization can do, it can divert the energy of the group members through certain processes, not only transferring or dismantling the proximity and propinquity between members, but also creating those measures which divert the energy of the individual members, group members, through certain mechanisms, which are the foremost that came up is the quality circle, the team building processes, and these have been found to have some kind of positive impact on people's morale and the desire to work effectively. Communication, we have already discussed. The formal communication is explained in terms of encoding, that is sending encoded words, transmitting, then decoding, and then responding. This is a process, and this is not unilateral, but it is bilateral and is in a cycle. Communication doesn't mean that I talk to you and that's the end, or you talk to me, that's the end. No, it is how I am encoding the message, how am I transmitting it, how am I decoding it, how the receiver is decoding it and responding. So, the encoding and transmission is in the control of the sender. He or she decides how to send it, by telephone, by fax, by letters, by commands, and all these things. Certain things can be under the control of the sender, but the decoding and responding are with the receiver. What you say and how it is responded are two things to be understood, and they must collate. It's not that the one message is sent and the person understand it in a different way. If this happens in the organization, problems start brewing. Now this communication is filtered, and how it is filtered? This is from the perceptual process at the cognitive level, meaning that how the person is perceiving the communication. That includes where it is coming from, what is the communication about, is it a routine or a novel one? That is the understanding, and this understanding is exhibited by receiving, organizing, interpreting, internalizing, and giving feedback to the organization or to the sender as per their expectations. The expectations are the most important thing here. These are to be met, both of the sender as well as the receiver. There are certain situational factors other than dispositions which affect the perception. Suppose somebody had an accident and not in a proper frame of mind. If that person is given a command which is urgent, then he or she may not respond what is known as the natural way, normal way. So the understanding is what is required. So this personal and interpersonal factors, they are very prominent and prevalent. The formal organization system can create certain situational compulsions for desired personal perceptual outcomes, and this is possible only through culture building. If the organization, it cannot be done in a vacuum, so you have to have a positive culture. Free rein communication system. People must have the freedom to talk and approach people. It should not be very restrictive. That used to happen in the bureaucratic system. The empowerment strategies which will mature the individuals to higher levels of perception. So, in other words, the employee must be empowered through motivation or any other means. One of the things is OCB, the Organizational Citizenship Behavior, earlier talked about, that will create maturity and right kind of approach towards organizational functioning. We have talked about OCB, and here are certain explanations which are there: altruism, civic virtues, conscientiousness, courtesy, sportsmanship. And ERB is the extra effort that the individual makes in creating a positive environment.